Today we're going to be reading a passage from page 126 of The Color of Water by James McBride. He'd had a stroke. I was 14 and didn't know what a stroke was. I thought it was something you got from the sun. For me, the 2 weeks or so he was in the hospital meant I could hang out with my friends as long and as late as I wanted to, and I avoided going to see him until Mommy forced me to. I went with my sister Kathy, and when we walked into the hospital room, it was a brutal shock. He was laid out in hospital white. His face was slightly twisted. He could not talk. He could not move his right arm or side. His hand, a strong brown veined hand that I had seen gripping wrenches and tools and pipe fittings hundreds of times, was nearly limp, covered with IV gauze and connected to an IV. Mommy sat by him in silence, her face ashen. Kathy, who was always his favorite, walked into the room and saw him, and backed away from him, horrified. She could not look at him. She sat on a chair near the window and stared outside, crying softly. He raised his hand to comfort her and made some sort of horrid gurgling speech noise to get her attention. She finally came over to him and laid her hand on his chest and wept uncontrollably. I walked out of the room, wiping my tears, staggering toward the elevator, covering my eyes so no one could see, as nurses and hospital aides backed out of the way.
So, Webbs, what's your take on this passage?
Well, Ryan, I'm glad you asked. James McBride starts the passage out with, "He'd had a stroke." Period. That's straight and to the point. Right in there, James wastes no time revealing an emotional part of his life in the memoir.
Something that I thought was interesting in this passage is when he says, for the first 2 weeks, for him, it was just that he could stay out with his friends longer. Like, that's all that he really cared about. He didn't actually care that his stepfather had had a stroke, but for him, it was just, oh yeah, now I can stay out with my friends longer. And it isn't until he actually visits him that he really sees how serious this is.
What a jerk. So, Baylog, what's your take on McBride's tone in this passage?
What was interesting was McBride's tone. At the start of the passage, it's like lighthearted. He doesn't really care as much about his father's stroke. But then as the passage progresses, McBride takes a more serious tone and gets more depressed and somber because his reality becomes more miserable.
You mentioned tone. I find it that he starts out rather surprised, He talks about, he's 14, he doesn't know what a stroke was, and his stepdad just had a stroke. That's the guy that raised him. But then, as he continues talking about his friends and then his family, and then when he gets into details about Kathy not even being able to look, it's just miserable and depressing, and I think he really understands the gravity of the situation. And look at this. He'd had a stroke. I was 14 and I didn't know what a stroke was. I thought it was something you got from the sun. McBride starts this passage out with really short sentences that reveal a colloquial style, like he's talking to a friend and explaining what happened at his when he just found out that his dad had a stroke. And it's kind of surreal for him. He's breaking down and he's just taking it easy. And then he explains, for me, the 2 weeks or so he was in the hospital meant I could hang out with friends as long and late as I wanted to. Revealing he is pretty much talking to another friend, trying to show off like he's cool. And it's a rather touchy subject.
James's mother, Ruth, also seems to be devastated about these events to the point where she can't even look at her own husband because she doesn't like the condition that he's in, and she can't even make eye contact with him anymore.
Fine inquiry, Baylog. I find it that when James McBride says his hand, a strong brown veined hand that I'd seen gripping wrenches and tools and pipe fittings hundreds of times, was nearly limp, covered with IV gauze, and connected to an IV. I find this juxtaposition here of the nearly limp hand to the strong hand that was seen fixing things years ago that James McBride's talking about. It's his father, and it's just weird to see him in such a vulnerable and disabled position. So, Baylog, how do you think this specific memory contributes to the overall memoir?
This memory is important because it shows how the two characters, Ruth and James, handle tragedy as a whole, and how they cope emotionally with bad things happening in their lives.
Thanks for watching, Miss Mac. This has been Book Talks with me and Baylog.